On this month's University of Arizona Futures in Digital Learning podcast, we bring you a conversation with Dr. Marla Franco, Vice President of Hispanic Serving Institution Initiatives, and Dr. Elizabeth Pope, Associate Professor of Practice in Educational Psychology, to discuss their research project, Understanding Student and Faculty Experiences at HSIs during COVID-19.
There really is no additional guidance or expectation or accountability from the U.S. Department of Education helping to support HSIs in coming to understand what that is. And so it really is for institutions to define themselves how they want to actualize and materialize that designation and put it into practice.
Join us as we discuss strategies for humanizing learning and ways institutions can learn from and support students in online spaces. Hello and welcome to the Futures of Digital Learning podcast. My name is Adam Davi. Once again, I'm excited for you all to join us today, and I'm excited for our guests that we have today. I'm joined by Dr. Marla Franco, Vice President of Hispanic Serving Institution Initiatives, and Dr. Elizabeth Pope, Associate Professor of Practice in Educational Psychology, both here at the University of Arizona. Welcome, both of you, to our podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
And I've invited both of them here today because they were the main investigators in a research study called Understanding Student and Faculty Experiences at HSIs during COVID-19. And throughout the study, you all talk about, what are student perceptions in online spaces during COVID. Since we myself and others in the ID world work in online spaces, I thought this would be great to hear a little bit about your project and what it entails and what you found. But first, I want to make sure that all the listeners know about HSIs, Hispanic Serving Institutions. So I'm going to tap Marla to kind of give us a little information about what that entails and what that means for us here at U Arizona.
Yeah, absolutely. So the designation Hispanic Serving Institutions is actually a federal designation that comes by way of the U.S. Department of Education. And the primary criteria for being an eligible HSI is that you have at minimum 25% undergraduate Hispanic enrollment. And so there are actually 559 Hispanic serving institutions across the nation.
Wow.
In Arizona alone, there are 20 HSIs, and the University of Arizona is one of those 20, having become federally designated as an HSI in 2018. And so one of the things that I think is so important is that beyond that primary enrollment criteria, there really is no additional guidance or expectation or accountability from the U.S. Department of Education helping to support, HSIs in coming to understand what that is. And so it really is for institutions to define themselves how they want to actualize and materialize that designation and put it into practice. And so certainly this project was incredibly timely. It's funded by the National Science Foundation, and it was part of some additional funding during the pandemic that was pushed through the National Science Foundation that presented some brand new opportunities to really give HSIs an opportunity to think about, how to study what was happening and how to really support students, faculty, staff, and instructors through this process. And so that's where myself and Dr. Elizabeth Pope and our other co-PI, Dr. Monica Urbacher, were able to come together and apply for funding to pursue this research project, all with an interest in wanting to utilize this data to have it circle back and inform the University of Arizona during the pandemic as to what students were experiencing, what faculty and instructors were experiencing, what supports they were utilizing, what supports they most needed, so that we could kind of right course and provide people the level of support with as they were navigating through the pandemic. And then how could we also take this data and share it with our colleagues at other Arizona HSIs as they were navigating the pandemic themselves?
Yeah, and that's fascinating. And I think too, this information, even though it's, you're talking about navigating through the pandemic. I think just kind of reading what's been published and reading what you have on the website as well. That's information that can be used, long term as well. So I'm curious, what kind of surprised you about what you found so far? What what has come up that has been interesting, or that maybe you didn't expect to find during the course of this study?
Elizabeth, not sure how you want to jump in here.
Sure.
It's interesting though, because I think, we met quite frequently during the course of the project, and we're monitoring the data as they came in, and we're really kind of trying to digest. And this was also, there were 3 points in time. So it was a longitudinal study. So what was interesting about the study design, and it was also both mixed methods, quantitative and qualitative, is that as each wave came in, we were quickly rapid fire, like analyzing, cleaning the data, analyzing it, digesting it, trying to summarize it, and then trying to get those data-informed insights and recommendations into the hands of the right people. But needless to say, I remember conversations, Elizabeth, and with our colleague, Dr. Erbacher, and, while some of it was quite confirmatory, right? I think it was things that we had like a general solid pulse on in terms of what the students were experiencing, what the faculty were experiencing. But certainly there were, some insights that maybe Elizabeth can share about things that were like, oh, okay, we didn't quite think of that, or, that was kind of beyond the scope of, what we had heard kind of on campus or on social media, or, within our networks. So absolutely.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was really important and surprising in a good way that was in the article that you saw, Adam, one of the things that we asked participants about were their coping strategies.
Right.
And from the undergraduate group, they had really healthy coping mechanisms. And I know personally, I felt like I was floundering for a long time. And so it was really, I think it's a testament to the undergraduate student population. And it really made me think about the strength that these young people have, and thinking about that in the future is really encouraging and exciting. And I think sometimes being of older generational cohorts, we tend to be a little harsh on younger students and talk about them from this deficit perspective of all the things that they're lacking and they're not doing. And it's like, but wait a minute, during this really, really difficult time, they had really healthy coping mechanisms. And it wasn't just that it was a difficult time, but then if you remember in that article, one of the other measures that we discussed were the measures of sleep. And so they were incredibly sleep deprived.
Yeah.
yet still managing to employ healthy coping mechanisms. So I think it's important, really, one of our main goals throughout this entire project, for as long as we are able to discuss it in a valuable way, I think, is to really center the voices of the faculty, the students, undergraduate and graduate students, in a way that highlights the strengths and what can we learn institutionally from things individuals were doing that maybe we can kind of think about from an institutional level. Okay, so here are things that were really helpful for people during a very stressful time. How can we as an institution provide some of those supports so that it's not their individual burden to be able to kind of fight their way through in that sense. So that was surprising. I also think it was surprising, and Marla, you probably remember this from going through the qualitative data. One of the things we did is we would ask students, what were the top 3 things that instructors did that were helpful for your learning? What were things that were not so helpful? There was a great growth that appeared in the data. So obviously in the beginning, we were all thrust into this like emergency online situation. I was one of the very few lucky people who my classes were online anyway at the time. So it was, no big deal. But a lot of what I was doing was the kind of the soft skills of education, right? So students were freaking out a little bit, understandably so, right? And I don't know where I'm going. I just have to leave campus, and my family's in Washington, and they told me don't come here. I don't know where I'm going to live. And so kind of helping them understand that, yes, this is a lot for everyone. And the most important thing is that you find a safe place to be, and then we'll figure out how to carry on with class. But for now, find a safe place to be. And students who were very, very hard on themselves. Oh, I feel like I'm not living up to my own expectations. And again, sort of providing that greater perspective and some reassurance that it's hard to be human in the world right now. And you know what? We are all doing the best we can. And sometimes that has to be good enough. But then after that initial spring 2020, everybody sort of had an opportunity to adjust. And humans are remarkable in that way. We're really good at adapting, but it takes some time.
Yeah.
And so it was interesting to see in the data how in the original data collection, it was chaos, right? And students were confused and frustrated, and instructors were confused and frustrated. Fall, I think instructionally, people had a better sense of, okay, what do students need to actually be successful in this online format? And then there were those of us that were sort of in that limbo phase, right? Of like, I had a class that was supposed to be in person, but it was a big class. So we were sort of in that like, well, you might be in person sometime, but TBD, and we don't know when. So I spent the entire summer trying to figure out, how am I going to design this course with consistency? Because I knew from the spring data, consistency is important. Students need to be able to plan their world and their lives. And if things are changing at the drop of a hat, you can't plan. And so it adds a level of anxiety and stress. And so trying to figure out a way to navigate this, what was at the time flex in person, but very different from what we consider flex in person now, trying to figure that out. And had I not had access to that data in the spring, I think I would have had a very different perspective. And so in the fall, the responses from students and instructors, it was clear that there was a lot more forethought happening in terms of, how do I design this course? And students noticed, and students appreciated it. And there was a much greater sense. There was a much greater sense of efficacy. There were themes that popped up that we were like, okay, this is good. We're moving in the right direction. And then finally in the fall, I think things started to sort of settle down a little bit more. And still there was some uncertainty, but I think people had really come to a good place in terms of figuring out how to navigate with some level of uncertainty. So again, I think main story is that it was really, really hard, but there were some amazing things that happened, including the ability to adapt and overcome. And so I hope that that's something that will continue to be a discussion, that individuals really took on a lot of responsibility, students, faculty, staff. And because of that, we were able to navigate this successfully. And I think there needs to be a lot of continuing going forward. There needs to be a lot of recognition and credit for all of those things. Because it was really challenging.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. And you mentioned, kind of at the beginning, this, like, people didn't know what they were doing. And our office got a lot of that on the faculty and instructor side, right? Those instructors who have never taught online before were thrust into this and didn't know what was happening, what to do. The support maybe wasn't as much as they either knew about or within their department, we're able to handle. And we got a lot of that in our department, in our group. And we did our best to try to, offer supports and do things. And so it's kind of nice to hear that there was that growth. Like, obviously we see it in kind of a small scope with the instructors that we deal with. But it's nice to hear that, you kind of maybe saw it on a larger scale, institution-wide, that, there was that, and there was, the word was getting out, and things were happening and getting better. And I'm curious, you mentioned kind of institutional supports moving forward, for HSIs, for live online, flex online, whatever new name it's got, this month and whatnot. What types of things would you say you would recommend as far as like an institutional support moving forward, based on kind of some of your findings in this study?
There was a graduate student of ours who worked with a subset of the data from graduate students. And she was really interested in the emotional experiences of students. And it was really fascinating, because what she found was that for graduate students, it was like they were experiencing the extremes of both polar ends of emotional experiences, right? So they did feel joy, and they did feel happiness, but they also felt really lonely and sad and anxious. And what she was really kind of confused by, but it actually makes a lot of sense to me. So this is a very different, most of the time we would expect that students would experience like one or the other, and they have kind of this inverse relationship. The more positive experiences you have emotionally, the fewer negative ones you have. But this was like, no, everyone is just on system overload at both ends of the spectrum. But what was missing were feelings that we call complex emotions. People weren't experiencing pride, but people also weren't experiencing shame. And so we started talking about this during her defense, and I said, you know what, this makes me wonder, what about because this was during the first wave of data collection. So this would have been during that emergency online transition, right?
Yeah.
And I said, I wonder what it is about how those online courses were conducted that created that kind of disconnect. And my suspicion is that there's something that was going on where, when you're in person, I turn in this assignment and I'm anticipating that my instructor is going to say, this is excellent. And I will then feel a sense of pride because I did a good thing. So there's a dynamic interplay between two people. And it seems like a lot of that was shut off. So I think one thing to really think about in terms of institutional support and instructional design is, how do you add that back in a way that feels authentic? Because I don't think it's a discussion board.
No.
Is it doing things like, I started playing around with giving students feedback through the little video clips on D2L, right?
Yeah.
So, hey, I really love that you brought up ABC. I think you're on the right track with your thinking. And I'm really wondering about this thing. And so they were really short little feedback videos.
Yeah.
But just something to kind of like rehumanize this experience, that it's not purely transactional.
Right.
So that's one thing I think is important to think about, that at the end of the day, we are all human beings. And learning is an emotional human thing. And so how do you think about designing and supporting the emotional aspect of learning? And then another thing that I've been thinking about, and that we're sort of moving in this direction now with the data, we did interviews with participants, and in listening to these interviews, again, it's really apparent that students, faculty, graduate students There are these amazing stories of strength and resilience and the things that people did to keep themselves from being exhausted, burned out.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's sort of the next step, is to look at, okay, what are the things that, again, individuals were doing that were really helpful for keeping them in a good space to be their most effective? And how can we then turn that into recommendations at the institutional level?
Right.
And so we are looking at that using Tara Yasso's framework for cultural capital. And so we're going to kind of try to pull in some of these examples of things that individual people did and say, okay, where does this fit in this framework of cultural capital? And how can we make recommendations for the institution to really support the people in this community so that they don't have to do that themselves? And you think about how much time and space and energy that would free up for individuals, right?
Right.
The amount of growth and learning and community building that's possible is exciting to think about. So hopefully that will produce something useful that people will really take on and put into action.
Yeah, that's great. I love that you brought up the idea of humanizing learning, and that's something that has been a buzzword in the online learning community for the past couple of years, and kind of ways to do that. And I'm curious, because this was focused here at an HSI, and I know in the study you kind of broke down Latinx students and whatnot. Like, what are ways that we can kind of humanize learning, especially focused on those underserved populations, the first gen students, our native students as well, obviously our Latinx students. Like, what, is this a universal thing, or are there things that we can be doing better institutionally for those populations?
Well, I think there are always things that we can do better, right?
Right.
And from my perspective, I think one thing that's really important is to really be open to questioning, what's my role as an instructor? What do I want my students to get out of this? Traditionally, I think as instructors, the view was sort of, well, I'm the one with the information.
Right.
I'm the one with the knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But if we truly want to serve the students in our community, what I think of as useful knowledge might not be. Right. And so to make sure that I'm continuously questioning and interrogating this whole idea of I'm the one with the knowledge, right? Because I don't think that's the best approach for any learning situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
In ideal situations, you want everybody who's part of this learning community to feel empowered to share their experiences and their knowledge. And together we co-construct something that's even better because we have all of these perspectives and this huge pool of knowledge. So it's not just I'm standing here to give you information and then you should repeat it back to me in exactly the same way. And everybody's done what they needed to do and we're out of here.
Yeah.
That's not meaningful and it's not human, right? Because it's not recognizing that all of these other people in the room or in this online class or whatever the context is also have really valuable contributions to make. So turn it over to you, Marla. I'm sure you've got lots to add.
Well, I mean, I think in many ways, there are aspects of the concept and practice of humanizing education, humanizing learning experiences and environments. I think much of that maps on quite well to the notion of centering servingness at Hispanic serving institutions. Because to center servingness, an aspect of that really is to come to understand those who you are teaching and engaging in this learning environment, right? And so to teach in a way that doesn't take the learner's aspects of the learner's identity and lived experiences into account, right? I think truly misses the mark on a deep substantive learning that is possible, right? And so, I think that there absolutely, are ways that we can think about, supporting, learners who identify as Black, Indigenous, students of color, so BIPOC communities, taking into account the lived experiences, first generation college students, Pell eligible students, right? And many other forms of diverse learners. And so I think that it actually maps on quite nicely to the concept of humanizing education. I think that oftentimes when we are able to center the identities, the lived experiences, the language, the methodologies and pedagogies of teaching and learning that are anything different than, kind of what Western ways of knowing and being and teaching, right? I think really add to the richness of everyone's learning, both the students and instructors and faculty. And so there are lots of kind of both micro and macro ways to find moments and opportunities, to do that. I know that through one of the programs that we have, the HSI Fellows Program, there's a project component in the Fellows Program where faculty and staff are able to kind of really chart a course or recommendations or identify opportunities to really strengthen and center servingness. And there's this one team that worked on kind of a multi-pronged project. And one of the things was about utilizing tools that at the very beginning of a course, students were asked as kind of this little mini micro assignment to record a video introduction with them introducing themselves and the pronunciation of their name as they wanted it. And it's pretty powerful to be named correctly, and for your instructor, to know how to pronounce that and to take the time and the effort to do that. So those are just kind of little micro affirmations, right, that I think center the identity of the student, center them in the learning experience, make them feel seen, heard, affirmed in very small ways that potentially can have quite impactful moments on a student's learning experience.
That's great. I'm really glad you brought up that project, Marla, because I think that's such a little thing, but so impactful. And I think kind of touching on what Elizabeth brought up too, as far as like feedback in an online course, it's asynchronous. We think of it as being kind of transactional. But if you can give feedback in that video form and show that you are pronouncing a student's name correctly, right, based on what they shared, I think that can go a long way to helping that student, feel a sense of belonging and feel like, oh, okay, this instructor is, there is some community here in this course, and doing some things like that. And so, I think that's wonderful. And I know that it's easy to overlook that, especially in online courses where, a student's name is just maybe a word on the screen for the most part, but we can take advantage of that, and we can, really do something impactful with that as well. And so I'm curious too, Marla, about, some of the projects through the HSI Fellows Program. Are those projects accessible to people, throughout the institution? Can they kind of look up and see what cool things are happening?
I mean, we are doing a little bit of a revamp. We've actually pressed pause on recruiting for the next cohort because we're actually going to be undergoing a research project. We've had 5 amazing runs of HSI fellow cohorts. That program is a year-long cohort-based leadership development program for faculty and staff at the University of Arizona. We're super honored to receive far more many applications than we can accommodate. But really, it provides an in-depth opportunity through the course of an academic year to engage as a cohort of learners themselves to really be immersed and come to a much greater depthful awareness and understanding and exposure to what it means to lead and teach and learn and work at an HSI. And one of the components that I think that helps take faculty and staff from awareness to the practice of doing, right, is through this project-based component that's part of the HSI Fellows Program. And so there's a couple of, the cohort itself breaks up into smaller groups and creates these project team clusters, and they identify kind of a gap, a challenge, and opportunity, as well as chart a course for advancing, strengthening servingness and equity. And often some of them are even able to implement elements or full components of those projects, or sometimes it makes best sense to then hand deliver or do a handoff with HSI initiatives or faculty development, or really other areas that might need to more predominantly, kind of own that work and provide leadership and continuity to it moving forward. And so we're super excited. We're going to take a little bit of a pause because we want to really document and research the impact personally and professionally to the fellows themselves, as well as the impact to the university. And so we're looking forward to coming out with some of those insights, and to also utilize them to keep informing and innovating the program itself. While it's working exceptionally well, I also want to, take advantage of the opportunity that we have within this organizational culture to keep innovating in this space and around this. This program has served as a model to other HSIs across the nation. And so certainly want to take the opportunity to make sure that we're innovating and, pushing ourselves as well. It's like, okay, 5 great runs, but like, how could we possibly take this to the next level? Or how could we further leverage this to enhance, the student experience and student learning? So I'm excited for this next leg of the program. And certainly, we'll be informed by, this current research project as well. And so there were certainly many insights around, I think around teaching and learning that the students communicated, but then I think one of the important insights, that I think we heard both, anecdotally everyone did, but then I think this research really helped provide both the quantitative and the qualitative data, to name it, just was around, students want their learning experience to be crafted in a way where the approach is holistic, right? So while you might have, as an instructor, you might have a student for a 50-minute course period or a 2-hour course period, whatever that might be, right? Holistically, students were able to, I think, very candidly name and describe and provide illustrations and anecdotes of what all else was going on in their life, right? And instructors were too. Instructors, like how do we humanize their experience as an instructors and faculty, right? I mean, I think sometimes we saw some tensions in the data between what students expected from instructors and faculty, and honoring the humanity of faculty and staff. I mean, they too, the data revealed that they too experienced challenges, connectivity challenges with reliable internet. We also think that our faculty and instructors and staff might have everything they needed to transition and pivot and, quickly to a virtual environment, but neither did they. And so certainly saw some tension in the data around, student expectations of faculty and instructors, and, they too, faculty and instructors perhaps, had, school age children at home themselves, right? So they were both, in charge of, leading and instructing, a course for college students, while also supporting, their 3rd grader, their 6th grader, and their, kindergarten, child, in a really tough, challenging learning environment as well. So that was certainly revealed in the data. I mean, I think as it relates to teaching and learning, there were a few things that students said, especially in that preliminary data. And they talked about, wanting instructors to really come to understand the full functionality and utilization of the full functionality of learning management systems. So they're like, I wish my instructor would use these features features, right? Offering more online office hours. And so, I don't think, perhaps maybe there were faculty and instructors who had never done that before. And so, some faculty and instructors reported, even greater utilization of office hours, more generally speaking, because they were offered the duality in which they were offered, right? And so, how many faculty and instructors, continue to offer, both types of formats. I think, providing flexible due dates and options for different types of learners, right? So not even sticking to, kind of the route, learning opportunities and expectations for, communicating, satisfactory understanding around certain, learning objectives. How do we think about, various options and assignments for different types of learners? Students even talked about accounting for time zone differences. I mean, I imagine that there to some extent, like that still is the case for many of our students that we might support in an online environment. They potentially could be anywhere. And so students really talked about that. There was a lot that was communicated by students around the pass-fail grading option as well. And there was a lot that students were really trying to advocate to see that be continued. And so there was, certainly some flexibility for a certain period of time around that. And then collectively as an institution, there was some decisions to, kind of return to normal around grading options. Flexibility regarding absences due to illness, so students really wanting to kind of honor like not coming to class or not engaging online, if they were feeling sick. And students also talked a lot about our communication style, both as an institution and communication that they were getting from instructors. And I think that that's also a big area where we have, we had a lot to learn. And I think that that's those key insights, though, that students communicated are definitely far surpass the scope of the pandemic for us to benefit from those insights. Students talked about needing to hear from us, but wanting the communication to be timely, concise, helpful, and resource specific. They talked also about like the need to recirculate communication about resources, knowing that sometimes, the first time you see it, it might kind of not stick or land, or you may not even need it at the moment, but you don't know that you're going to need it, 4 weeks into the semester versus week 1, right? And so wanting those reminders about, Wi-Fi, loaner laptops, resources that are at no additional cost to students that they can access. So, lots of insightful, I think, feedback and data-informed insights from both students and instructors.
It's, most of the work that I do and we do with digital learning, at least before the pandemic, has been related to Arizona Online, which has a, much more non-traditional student population. And some of the things you talk about, we bring up, we account for and things like that for that population. And I think, what you said, Marla, is the pandemic really, I think, opened people's eyes to the fact that our main campus students are dealing with a lot of those same things. And we, I think we fell into the trap of assuming that they were full-time students and full-time students only. And that was their whole identity, right? And that's not the case. And so, and I think this has really opened our eyes to see that, oh no, there's more to our students, and we should value that. And to touch on something that Elizabeth brought up earlier too, the idea of content creation and throwing that out there. Students are powerful content creators. And, the more we can tap into that, I think the more that we can provide ownership for the students over their own learning. And it's going to be a more valuable learning experience for them. So, I'm so excited to, kind of get this message more out there. The things that have kind of come about through your research and through some of the things that you mentioned, because I think it's great. And I think it is nice, I've done some work, in other departments, throughout the university before my time in digital learning in UCAT. And, I was a proponent of getting more things online for students, right? You got to meet them where they are, and they're not always on campus. right? And I think this has been kind of eye-opening for everybody to realize, like, oh yeah, maybe we need to do more of that and get that out there. And so, you know, thank you for kind of shining a light on some of these things. You know, I hope we can move, you know, really move forward on that and whatnot, because I think it's really great.
Yeah, and I just think there's so much potential. I think the traditional model of college and university learning is in many ways optimized for us as faculty or instructors.
Right.
And what I love about Marla's construct of servingness is that it really challenges people to rethink that.
Yeah.
And wait a minute, maybe this really should be optimized for the students.
Yeah.
Because that's why I'm here.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really, really important. And I think that's something that can transcend many levels of leadership in an institution, right? So if I, as an instructor, am reimagining my courses so that they're optimized for this group of students,
right,
not the same thing every time,
right,
but for this group of students. And wouldn't that be great then if my department head, if my dean, if my senior leadership team could then think about their jobs as well? How can they optimize this for the whole community, right? How can they make faculty, how can they enable them to do their jobs even better, so that we can continue to optimize for the student experience? So I think it really does sort of flow all the way up the stream there. One of the other things that we're looking at right now is specific to students who were in lab courses during this year and a half.
Yeah.
And so we've got a manuscript that we are submitting to the International Journal of Science Education, where we are looking at the data that students and instructors provided us for their experience in lab courses. And we are really looking at it from the angle of, here's what they said worked during the pandemic. So how can we think about that in terms of like recommendations for online instructors in these STEM courses? And that's actually been really fun to look at. I've spent a lot of time in that data over the past several weeks. And yeah, it's really interesting because so many of the things that students say, this was really helpful, this was really useful. I'm like, yeah, why don't we do that all the time?
Right.
It was really helpful for me to have a demonstration video of the lab that we were going to do. So even when more people were on campus in the fall or in the spring of 2021, they would say things like, you know, having this information ahead of time allowed me to go to lab and actually engage in learning.
Yeah.
I wasn't confused. I didn't just miss that step over there. Like I walked in with knowledge and I knew what to expect. And so I think those are things that going forward, I really hope that we can continue to think about and use to our advantage to make the student experience even better.
Yeah.
Well, I'll put a plug out there for any STEM teachers listening to this that, you know, we have some video services you can sign up for, you know, go to ucat.arizona.edu. You can, you know, get in touch with us and if you want to put some labs on video for your online students, we'd be happy to help you with that.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of like the inclination that we all have these days, right? It's like if we're attempting to do something, maybe it's like fixing a household item, right? Or I don't know, something.
Gotta YouTube that.
You go look for the instructional video first, right? And then you attempt to do it yourself, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's just kind of this adaptive way of learning, of being able to, you know, see it, you know, hear someone do it, you know, and then go make your attempt yourself with a bit more context and understanding of what you're just about to encounter. And so, you know, in some ways, I think it highlights and it reminds me about some of the, so we, you know, students talked about some of the structured resources that they felt, some of the instructor practices that helped the undergraduate students specifically. And so they talked a lot about some of the structured resources, so things like we're just talking about, recorded class lectures, providing instructional resources, study guides, creating a schedule, changing curriculum to better fit the online learning environment. I think, these students were very smart and savvy. They knew all too well that, something that was designed for a very traditional in-person, within four walls type of learning experience was just tried, the instructor tried to, kind of force fit it into this online environment, and students took note of that, and they observed that and knew that it fell short of what was possible. And so, lots of little tidbits that I think the student data imparted on us that certainly can serve us well as faculty and instructors who are, definitely seeking to provide, highly engaged substantive learning experiences for, a diverse set of learners.
Yeah. I just have a quick story, kind of touching on being adaptive. I taught a face-to-face course this past fall. And there was a group project in the course, and students were getting together. They were going to have to meet outside of class, and here I thought they were going to exchange numbers or email addresses, but no, they exchanged Instagram handles. And they communicated with each other via Instagram. And I was like, my mind was blown, and I'm like, oh, this is where the students are like this. They're on Instagram, and I'm not advocating for instructors to, friend their students on Instagram or whatnot to communicate, but it's something to think about, right? Like, where we say meet students where they are. They're not even texting each other anymore. They're DMing each other. And,
I have two teenagers. And that's exactly their strategies. So it's funny. At least from peer to peer, right? Like that's how they're managing their exchange and collaboration and peer engagement, right? Maybe, in supplementing, what will happen in person, or maybe exclusively, in that way, if it's purely an online learning environment. So absolutely.
Well, Elizabeth, that you looked like you were going to say something to touch on that, or maybe not.
No, I just think that's great. I think there's so much that students do on their own that is different from maybe what we've done historically or traditionally, but that doesn't mean that there isn't value there. And so I think that's been apparent in all of our data, that our students are smart and they are well equipped and they have important, valuable things to contribute. And so let's work together with that.
And I think that's a big key, is to get student feedback and get it in a way that is helpful. Not just the student course surveys that they fill out, and at the end of the year, but what is informal feedback that we can give or that we can get from them, and how can we apply that?
Because it's all part of that learning cycle, right? I mean, students are reliant upon us for that kind of formative feedback, and so I think approaching it in that way and having that conversation with students of like, hey, I need to hear from you just as much as you need to hear from me. I think that's another way of really humanizing the experience from both the student and instructor perspective, so that there is a sense of, remember for like 5 minutes in the beginning of the pandemic when we were all in this together? We're still
all in this together, right? Like it's
communities, we really are. And we just have to make that little bit of extra effort to establish that as the norm.
I agree, and I think the more we do that, the better our learning communities will be. And I'm very grateful to have this conversation with you both. I could keep going on for hours. I think there's a lot more to unpack, and I think I'm looking forward to seeing more of what's coming out from your research as well. And we'll share it on our end. With everybody in our department and those listening to this podcast. And hopefully sometime down the line we can reconvene, come back and chat again.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And yes, check out our project website. It's hsicovid.coe.arizona.edu. We keep it pretty up to date. Anytime new publications or student presentations and those types of things come out, they all go up there. Feel free to peruse and use anything that's useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Adam.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. And for those listening, thank you for listening. Tune in next month again, where next month we're going to be talking about neurodivergence and learning. So, another fascinating topic as well. So thank you again to Elizabeth and Marla for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Right.
Thank you.
Bye.
The Futures of Digital Learning podcast is a production of the University of Arizona University Center for Assessment, Teaching, and Technology. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas you'd like to share with our office, go to the Contact Us link on our website, ucatt.arizona.edu.